Hi, welcome to Abnormal Psychology. Today we're going over chapter one, where I think that there isn't a good video out there in order for you to get the subject matter. I will be recording and giving you a lecture this way. However, there are some really good videos out there that would sound better coming from someone else and that I would actually show in a face-to-face class too. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I've been teaching abnormal psychology for the last 8 years now, and my background is clinical psychology. So that means treatment, diagnosis, disorders, all according to our diagnostic manual called the DSM-5. And I no longer practice anymore because my main goal is to teach, which is what I'm doing, and I love being a teacher. And I noticed that for me personally, it was a little bit too hard on the soul. I practiced for 2 years and I have a lot of other experience in field studies, kind of going around making sure that I'm always keeping up with the latest updates in what's going on in the mental health field. And so you'll get a really good introduction to the world of abnormal psychology in this class. Okay, so let's get started with the first slide. So if you've ever had me for any other classes before, you know that I'm a person who is really big on definitions. This is mainly because we all come from different backgrounds, we all come from different disciplines, perhaps, even if you're not a psychology major. And in order to stay on the same page and know what we're talking about in this class, I have to make sure that you know the exact definition of what it is that we're talking about, right? So um, each of our definitions of feeling cold can range, right? So if I said, I feel cold whenever it dips below 72 degrees, right? And that could be because I've always been in California. I was born and raised in California, specifically the Bay Area, which I should be able to tolerate a little bit more cold than down here. But, you know, for others, it might be that cold for you is anything below 50 degrees, right? And there are people who live closer to the equator, or you just run a little bit, your body temperature runs a little bit different, and cold for you could mean something like 80 degrees. So this is the importance of definitions and to make sure that we are keeping psychology and especially abnormal psychology in the realm of staying scientific and objective. We've got to go with specific definitions. So how do we define psychological disorder? We are looking at abnormal behavior is something that involves disturbance of psychological functioning or behavior. Psychological in this term meaning mental health functioning or behavior. Psychological dysfunction associated with distress or impairment that is not typical or culturally appropriate. So I'm going to give you 5 criteria on the next slide, but first I want to address this image you have over to your right. So mental disorders are not adjectives. I know it's easier for us to say something like, oh, um, that person is autistic, but actually the more correct terminology to use would be my brother suffers from autism spectrum disorder. Things like this where you're seeing my mom yelled at me yesterday, she's so bipolar, you almost gave me a panic attack. For people who are familiar personally or even professionally with these disorders, something as simple as saying you almost gave me a panic attack for somebody who actually suffers from panic disorder and frequently has panic attacks, this is almost diminishing what they feel. And if you've ever felt a panic attack before, which we'll go over in future lectures, it is debilitating. It can make it seem like you are on the verge of dying, and for somebody to casually throw around, you almost gave me a panic attack, is not very empathetic towards a person who actually suffers from panic disorder. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So like I said, there are 5 main criteria that we look at when we're defining abnormal behavior. First, if you have had research methods or you're taking it this quarter, I'm sorry, not quarter, semester, but we're looking at clinical significance. And what clinical significance means is we're looking at a bell curve, right? So whether or not you've had research methods or statistics, I can break this down for you in a way to show you that we're typically looking at people who are on the outer edges of the spectrum, but not so much in terms of how many people suffer from a disorder, right? That means there's actually a very high prevalency of mood disorders such as depression, right? Major depressive disorder. And just because it's something that is more prevalent does not mean that it's clinically significant. Clinical significant refers to the mood. So being a mood disorder, we're looking at what's normal is sadness to happiness, but what's abnormal is feeling extremely elated all the time, ecstatic all the time without, without the use of any substances, but also dipping way below where a person feels um, to the point of depression, where the clinical diagnosis of depression, the definition, actually means to be somebody who feels completely numb. The world is gray. Uh, Even your most favorite foods taste like cardboard, right? So that's actually that's what we're looking at when we're looking at clinical significance, rather than how many people in the population actually suffer from a certain type of disorder. Second is maladaptive functioning. So this is where anytime you see BX, for those of you who have had my class before, any other psychology class, you should know that BX is shorthand for behavior. It will always mean behavior in psychology. So behavior that limits the ability to function or fulfill daily responsibilities. A lot of people don't know this, but it's typically normal for us to have thoughts of, what would it be like if I wasn't here, right? A lot of people won't disclose that information to, say, a counselor or a therapist because they feel like if I say something like this, they're going to lock me up. And that's not the case because that's actually normal functioning, right? However, if it's paired with other criteria that fit major depressive episodes and suicide ideality, we'll look at those later, but that in itself is not um, maladaptive functioning. Another thing that I can give you an example of is somebody who might be suffering from obsessive compulsive disorder, right? OCD, if it's a pretty popular one. So if you haven't heard of it before, this is a disorder that deals with a lot of repetitive behaviors, such as, and this is not for all people who suffer from OCD, but such as hand washing, right? Especially during a pandemic, you're going to see a lot more hand washing, which is great. That's definitely something we should be doing. But if we're talking about somebody who suffers from obsessive compulsive disorder and they are washing their hands consistently, after touching anything, that there is a cutoff where if it does not interfere with daily responsibilities, that is okay. That's not going to be considered maladaptive functioning. So an example where it would be maladaptive functioning is if you're washing your hands so often, it's such a ritualistic type of behavior for you that it makes you late to class, right? So if this was a face-to-face class or if we were meeting over Zoom. Um, I've had I've actually had clients who've told me that their behaviors, their obsessive compulsive behaviors, have actually made them 3 hours late to their sister's wedding, in which they were in the bridal party. I've had another client tell me that they would try to get to work. They would even wake up at 5 in the morning. Work wouldn't start until 9 a.m. for them, and their behaviors, the compulsions, actually made it so that they couldn't get to work until 2 p.m., 3 p.m. On days where the flare-ups were actually uncontrollable for them, and that would lead to daily responsibilities, right? So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about maladaptive functioning. If you have some compulsions that do kind of like make you a little bit late here and there, that's not quite considered maladaptive functioning. So we have specific criteria for each disorder. Another thing is distressing to the person who exhibits the behavior or mental processes, or to the people around them. So maybe to you, you think that how you're living is completely fine, but to loved ones, to your teachers, to your bosses, to your um, coworkers, to your coaches, if they see that something that the way that you're behaving or your mental processes are distressing, that could be a cue for them to um, point it out to you, right? It could also be distressing to you yourself, right? If you yourself feel like you don't meet criteria for something like major depressive disorder, but you notice that, it's been a really long time since I've actually felt like myself who was really enjoying life, just things like that, that is also going to meet this criteria. So one thing that I will keep repeating over the course of this semester is you need at least two of these five in order to meet criteria, plus any of the criteria for the disorders that we are going to be talking about. Okay, the next one is the fourth bullet point, I believe, socially unacceptable. So this is a little bit different depending on what culture and what community you're from. This is going to be behavior that deviates from what your culture considers normal. Considering typically like where we live right now, it's it's not totally acceptable to kind of dance around in the street, right? Although that would be awesome, that would be an awesome society. We typically are a little bit more reserved in that aspect, and that's just not a part of our culture that we live in here. But there are other cultures where that's the way to celebrate life and the way to just celebrate daily activities is to do that in the streets. But socially unacceptable here is deviating from the norm. Now, if you are someone who is trying to rebel from your parents or something like that, and you decide that you're going to get a bunch of piercings and tattoos, and they consider that socially unacceptable, that is not actually meeting criteria, because what you're doing is you're doing it on purpose in order to either rebel or get a reaction, whatever that may be, that does not meet criteria. So it has to be behavior that deviates from the norm, that is not quite intentional. The last criteria is non-typical or uncommon to society. So these are typically things like um, we talk about a lot of hard subjects in this class, but I like to give light examples every now and then. However, this is not one of those times. So the main thing I can think of right now is it is not common, it is not typical in our society to, ex how do I frame this? To acceptably commit suicide, right? So we don't live in a culture where that's something that is, you've shamed your family, and so this is what you need to do um, in order to really show society and your community that you mean better. So that is considered non-typical or uncommon in our society, even though prevalence of something like completed suicides are something that is, even though it's prevalent, it is non-typical and uncommon to our society. Here is the actual definition for that comes straight from the DSM-5, which you don't have to purchase this for this class because I go through most of the criteria, at least all the disorders we talk about. I give you all the criteria that you will need for this class. You won't need it for this class, but it's something that you may want in the future. Okay, so this is the long version of basically all the criteria that we just talked about. So instead of going over it with you, um, in order to save time for the rest of the presentation, I'll just leave this up for you. All right, so let's move on to what causes abnormal behavior. I just found this on PowerPoint, I think on like Microsoft 365. and thought it was really cool, so just added this in for you. Okay, so abnormal behavior is created by factors, a variety of factors, usually not just one. However, there are people who come from a specific school of thought. If you remember from Psych 101, all of those modern perspectives, right? There's 7. Actually, technically, there's 8 if you separate social psychologists from cultural psychologists, but we tend to talk about them together. So 7 major perspectives. But here, we'll talk about the main 3 that creates perspective for people who are theorists of causes of abnormal behavior. So the first is psychological factors. This has to do with personality traits, your ability to cope, perception. Biological factors, we're looking at genetics, what's passed down from biological mother, biological father, and biochemistry, right? So if drinking that Red Bull makes a change in your mental processes or behaviors, right? So I guess the new thing these days is Bang, right? That Bang energy drink. So drinking something like that, yes, by the way, it does change your biochemistry and also brain structure, right? So here's a fun fact for you. We don't actually talk about personality disorders until actually probably until like towards the end of the semester, but in caught and convicted serial killers, what we've seen is their amygdala, if you remember that from Psych 101, amygdala is 17% smaller than a healthy person, right? If you remember from Psych 101, amygdala is responsible for emotions and fear, right? So if you're thinking about somebody who has been caught for being a serial killer, you might come to a conclusion or might come up with correlations that say, what's the relationship here? It could be that if you don't have fear for getting caught or somebody fighting back or any other aversive types of reactions that could possibly happen to you, it might not stop you from doing some terrible behaviors, right? Uh, Other things are if you're not having a strong emotional reaction, if you don't feel like what it would be like to be in the victim's shoes, you might not register that as much because you don't actually feel that type of pain, that type of emotion. Next is sociocultural factors. I'm sorry, this might turn into a really long lecture. I'll try to keep it short in order to keep this file as small as possible. So sociocultural factors, experiences throughout life, family dynamics, anything that has to do with your environment, right? Something that it has to do with parenting styles, what, you know, typically birth order could actually follow in this as well. And the different types of, this falls into both biological and sociocultural factors, but the types of nutrients that are in your surrounding as you are developing. So here is a chart of the 3. You can pause this, but we're going to keep moving on as I just talked about all these. So in abnormal psychology, although there are people who have specific perspectives, say biological psychologists, right, or neuropsychologists who really focus on the biological factors, you'll have people say that, oh, abnormal psychology comes from this specifically. However, we don't ever want to play the game of, which perspective is right at the cost of what could possibly help the client in the most efficient way. So what we do is we merge all 3 of this together, and this comes up with the perspective we like to take. If you've had me for Psych 101 or any other professor for Psych 101, you may have heard this term before, and I'll show it to you on the next slide. We like to use the biopsychosocial perspective. So this is where we're merging all 3 of those factors, biological, psychological, and sociocultural factors, as influencing the development of not just the individual, but also the development of abnormal behaviors and possibly disorders. Let's look at some prominent themes in abnormal psychology throughout our not so great history. Okay, so there is the spiritual approach. This may sound barbaric to some of you, but these are things that are still happening in certain countries, right? So in certain cultures, spiritual approach is where we're looking at psychological disorders as product of possession by evil spirits or evil or demonic spirits. Okay, so treatments included trephination, which is trephining. You're going to see that in the top right-hand corner with the skulls that actually have holes in them. So this is not just one culture. Trephination has been found by archaeologists in cultures all over the world. So almost every continent, dating back 2,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, to 10,000 years ago, I'm not an archaeologist, but scientists have found these skulls that have these perforation marks. And the way that they have figured out how to date these bones and how to figure out the lifestyle of these people is a lot of these people survived. They lived and continued on living after these holes were made. The thought here was there was no anesthesia, by the way, so no like numbing, none of that. It was just the local shaman or witch doctor doing this in order to alleviate the person suffering from um, mental illness, alleviate them from these evil or demonic spirit possessions that would cause them to behave in a way that their society did not deem fit. Exorcism is another way, so ritually driving away spirits or evil in order to heal the client, and also treatments recommended by the church. So things like deportation, torture, burning at the stake. So if you can remember into history, Salem witch trials, right? They were stoned, burned at the stake, drowned, right? So these are things where I know that we're finding out a little bit more and more about what was actually happening in those days now, but from um, the traditional viewpoint, the way to deal with somebody who was not behaving as everyone else in society was to do these types of treatments. Okay, so let's look at the humanitarian approach. So the humanitarian approach, this was developed as a reaction against the spiritual approach, right? So punishment of people with psychiatric disorders. So that was seen as not really a great way to help somebody who was ill. Psychological disorders result from cruelty, stress, and poor living conditions. So it doesn't really make sense to have people be put into these worst conditions. So we're looking at moral treatment. People can control behaviors if they're in a quiet and restful environment. So during during the 1900s, we actually saw a lot of people being checked into what was then called asylums. During this time, if you went in and you actually saw what was going on, it was not a restful place. You can imagine a lot of us are at home right now, and it's kind of driving us a little bit stir crazy, even if you're somebody who's very introverted. This is starting to affect us in ways. So if you had someone who was already suffering from some type of mental illness and you stuck them in the dark, you stuck them in a place that had no windows, no light, and you had them handcuffed to their bed and they were unable to socialize or talk to anybody else, a lot of the times defecating and urinating on themselves, that would make the most sane person have a lot of negative effects. So there was a mental hygiene movement by Theodora Dix, and when she saw these things happening, she stood out and said, we have to start treating people who are ill, mentally ill, in humane ways in order to help them heal. So the deinstitutionalization movement, Dorothea Dix had a big role in that as well. This is also known as Mental Retardation Facilities and Community Mental Health Centered Construction Act. We no longer use the word mental retardation, but This was all part of the cleaning up of these asylums and institutions. Oh, sorry, I thought there was another line. Anyways, let's move on to the scientific approach. Over to the right, actually that's Claudius Galen. We'll start on the left, right? So you'll see a bust of Hippocrates. Over 2,000 years ago, you have Hippocrates, who is known as the father of modern medicine. He was really the first person to say there's something going on in the body that is affecting mental health. So a person might look healthy on the outside, but there's something going on the inside. And these four bodily fluids, if they were out of balance, if there was more blood than black bile or phlegm or green bile, then you're going to have these ailments come about, and the person is going to behave and have mental processes that don't quite fit with a healthy person of society. Then you have Claudius Galen, hundreds of years after that, who developed a system of medical knowledge based off of anatomical studies where at the time, he was going to really dig up graves and steal bodies in order to do these types of studies, as it was illegal and still is illegal today. You cannot go and dig up a body. Okay, so scientific approach. I'm not a huge fan of Benjamin Rush, as he was very racist, but he was known as the founder of American psychiatry, because he really gave more of the scientific approach influence to psychiatric disorders. So he did kind of fight for improvements by placing patients in their own wards. If we're talking about psychiatry, we will call individuals seeking treatment patients, but in therapy, we're actually calling people who are seeking treatment clients rather than patients. If you're working in any rehabilitation centers, it's actually illegal for you to call a person that is seeking treatment a patient. He would also give occupational therapy. He prohibited hospital visits from curiosity seekers looking for entertainment, right? So you couldn't just go and watch people as if they were a circus act, right? Which was what was happening in these days. So he also developed his own treatment, which we know now is not the best, but he would do bloodletting, purging, tranquilizing, as well as fright inducement, which we know that is not the way. And here is the familiar and famous Sigmund Freud. So he's the first person that we're talking about as we're looking at the scientific approach. So Sigmund Freud was actually a medical doctor. So he had his MD, he was a neurologist. Really, the scientific approach gained momentum as psychiatrists and psychologists proposed behavior models that included explanations and medically based treatments for abnormality, right? Instead of things like looking to a shaman or ritualistic types of beliefs like that, which if that is part of your culture, today we try to integrate. We definitely look at what's going on in your culture and we integrate the two as smoothly as we can. So we don't say that any culture is wrong. We are really looking to see how to better help the client heal in the most efficient way. So Sigmund Freud developed psychoanalysis. You should have learned this before. You should have heard of all of these people from 101, actually. Ivan Pavlov discovered classical conditioning. So he, remember, was first a physiologist who wanted to study digestion in dogs, right? So remember Pavlov and his dogs. And this really became his findings really became the basis for the behaviorist movement. Behaviorist movement is really looking at science and being objective and only really looking at things that you can observe and measure in order to keep psychology in the sciences. B.F. Skinner formulated a systematic approach to operant conditioning, and the type of therapy that I practiced had to do with basically everything came from Skinnerian concepts. And let me tell you, it really works. Whatever you want to change behavior-wise, I could help you change, right? If you wanted to quit smoking cigarettes, could help you change that. If you wanted to stop procrastinating, could help you change that. If you wanted to have a bowel movement every morning at 8 a.m., technically I could help you do that too. So that's very, behavior is what you do, and through operant conditioning, we can change a lot of these behaviors. Recent movements, so now we're looking at positive psychology. This does stem from not just the humanitarian approach, but the humanistic perspective. So again, from Psych 101, positive psychology emphasizes potential for growth and change throughout one's life, right? So this psychology is backed by empirical evidence. So there is science behind it, and that's why we see this as something that is very good for practice today. Psychological disorders are difficulties that inhibit the individual's ability to achieve highly subjective well-being and feelings of fulfillment, right? So if you have heard of mindfulness type of training, if you have heard of acceptance-based training, these are all things that really go along with positive psychology. Let's talk about research methods in abnormal psychology. So I won't repeat a lot of the research methods that you should have already seen in Psych 101, but I'm just going to give you a brief overview, and I might actually have a really good video that I could also put up in Blackboard for you to watch. So let's get into a brief overview of research methods in abnormal psychology. So anytime we are looking for treatment, we have to use the scientific method. You can't just pick and choose, I think this treatment's going to work. There are some times, even in my own practice, there were some times that we did have to get a little bit more crafty for behaviors that we couldn't change right away. So I remember this, I remember this one time I was working with a child that had autism, and it was my first day with him, and he really did not like me. I think the session that I spent with him was 3 hours long, and his parents were saying, be careful to me. And I was like, oh, don't worry, I'm not going to hurt him. That's one, unethical, illegal, and I would never do that. And they're like, no, you be careful because he is rough. And I was like, oh, okay. How bad can a 7-year-old be, right? So I was kind of telling him, look, you're not going to be able to get this reinforcement until you do this, this, this whatever it was. And he was having a tantrum, and then he proceeded to kind of attack me, and I would block him. And this was, what year was this? This was the year before they passed the act where uh, you could no longer have physical contact with children unless you were putting them in a basket hold and redirecting them away from you. And so I believe this, yeah, that had just passed that year. So I'm thinking 2000, maybe it was 2011. And so I would just redirect him as he continued to try to attack me. And at one point, he grabbed hold of my arms, and I was just kind of open-handed, blocking him off. And he started pinching the skin on my wrist, and you have no reaction. You have to make sure that the client knows that you're not going to get a reaction from them, or they're not going to get a reaction from you. Proceeded to keep going, and then he noticed that I wasn't making any facial expressions or reactions. So he stopped, and he pinched himself, recognized that it did hurt, and went back to pinching me until he broke skin. So after he broke my skin, I told him no, no, and then I had to come up with something completely on my toes. And I basically told him, I was like, it kind of looks like he just really doesn't want me to be here anymore. So I told him, it was the end of the session anyways, but I told him, I could stay here all day. I don't have to leave. So if you don't, if you don't do, what you're supposed to do, I'm going to stay. I'm going to stay all day, all night. I'm not leaving. I don't have to be anywhere. And he looked at me, and it took 2 seconds for him to stop, and he was like, okay, I'll do whatever, I'll do it. Just make sure that you leave, right? So that was that was a that was me thinking on my toes. For the most part, everything else has to do with when you can, there has to be objective material for you to draw from. And actually, what I used was a technique that typically we would use in behavioral sciences. And not just that, but we'll actually use it in different types of therapies as well. Okay, so um, if you remember the scientific method from not just Psych 101, but from high school and middle school, all those science classes, we still use the scientific method specifically to be objective, right? So testing ideas of psychological phenomena without bias before accepting the ideas as adequate explanations. So prior to this, psychology kind of had a bad rep for um, for people who believed in phrenology being the same as psychology. So phrenology was, the study of feeling a person's bumps on their heads to see what part of the personality it correlated with. So we no longer, we know that that is not a science. And even though psychology is considered a soft science, hard sciences, for example, are things like chemistry, biology, engineering, those types of sciences, we're still a science. So where was I? Don't remember. I think it was on the second one, right? So involves a progression of steps from posing questions of interest to sharing the results with the scientific community. Even if you fail, even if your idea was not right, you still want to publish the information, the data that you found in order to let the rest of the scientific community know that, hey, this doesn't work. Please don't waste your time because this came out with results that did not show um, any type of significance. Lastly, this process can be conducted with a variety of descriptive and experimental research designs. So we're going to start with descriptive research first before we actually come up with an experimental research design, because those descriptive ways are going to give us information on how we should conduct our experiment. So descriptive ways, remember, are things like naturalistic observation or surveys, and then you go into an experimental research design. Um, you don't just shoot blindly thinking this is going to work, let's create this experiment. You have to base it off of descriptive research prior to creating an experimental research. So here are the steps in scientific method. I know that sometimes you'll see 6 steps, sometimes you'll see 8 steps. Basically, for this class alone, you just need to know these 5. Perceive the question, form a hypothesis, test the hypothesis, draw conclusions, and report your results. All right, let's look at experimental design. I will take you through the most basic experimental design that you could possibly have, where there is just one independent variable, and then there's the dependent variables that go along with it, right? So the independent variable is the variable that is manipulated by the experimenter. So just a quick refresh, recap, if you don't remember what independent variable is, it's basically the treatment. Whatever it is, especially in clinical psychology, it is that thing that you are going to use in order to alleviate your client's ailments, right? So if we're talking about major depressive disorder, an independent variable could very well be cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Changing your thoughts and behaviors at the same time. That is, those are actually 2 variables, but that is, let's just say cognition, that is a variable that we are changing. Dependent variable is what we're measuring. So for the example that I used for major depressive disorder, we're going to measure depression, right? Does that depression lessen or stay the same or get worse with the involvement or with the introduction of the independent variable? Okay, so you have randomized controlled trial, and this is where we're looking at research where researchers randomly assign participants to conditions where they receive different forms of the intervention. So you're going to have, let's just stick with our last example. So if you're looking at major depressive disorder, all of your participants are going to have major depressive disorder, but we're going to randomly assign, so meaning we're just going to put their names in a hat, and draw from the hat which condition they're going to get, whether it's the treatment of cognitive behavioral therapy or no treatment or some kind of placebo or something like that, right? So those are just a few different conditions. We use randomization because this minimizes the chance of bias. Um, We'll talk a little bit more about bias on the next slide. Randomized controlled trials are used as the foundation for evidence-based treatment in which clients receive interventions based off of the findings of controlled clinical studies. So anytime you are told by a clinician that you're going to have this type of treatment, it's very likely that there's evidence to support that unless you sign up to be part of a clinical trial. And that's where these trials are happening. Usually they have to do some testing. You might want to ask whether or not you are a pilot group. If you are a beta group, right, there's already been a pilot group that has started and you're like a second batch, whatever it may be. That is your right to know all of that information. And a lot of people might go through with these randomized controlled trials because other treatments have not worked for them in the past and they really want to find a treatment that works for them. Okay, so you'll see placebo effect and experimenter effect. So these are not new. You should have learned this in Psych 101, so I'll just quickly go over it with you again. Placebo effect, something happens just because you think something happens. Right, so taking a sugar pill, thinking that it's going to cure your depression, right? Experimenter effect, right? I'm sorry, let me give you an example that goes along with the examples we've been going over, right? So let's say major depressive disorder. So just taking some kind of a pill or just being part of a trial, thinking you're getting treatment, could lead to happier moods because you're actually making effort towards it, right? Whereas it might not be the treatment at all, but just the fact that you think you're getting treatment. Experimenter effect um, is where whether or not you believe in placebo, it has to do with the way that the experimenter or the researcher or the primary investigator is actually treating you, right? So the tendency of experimenters' expectations for a study to unintentionally influence results of the study. So I'm going to switch it up and give you a different example, but I want this to kind of be relatable to possibly some students that are in here. I know that for me, this was the type of student that I was. I was an athlete in high school, so a lot of my math classes they just so happened to be at the end of the day, and I wasn't very strong in math. I still am not the strongest in math, but I always had teachers who were like, "Oh, you're an athlete? Okay, well, they just never really paid me attention. They never really gave me help because they assumed that I wasn't going to be good at math anyways. So what I felt was, okay, the way that they're treating me, I just don't really need to do that well in math. And that led to my grades dipping. Um, of course, there are probably other reasons as well, but that is experimenter effect, right? So anytime we have placebo effect, experimenter effect, this could largely skew the results of our studies, and we need to put things in place to make sure that our very expensive clinical trials that we've designed are not a waste of time and money and effort. So let's look at the next slide. So in order to control for this, we skipped one. There's actually a single blind method, and we don't typically do that, especially when we can do double blind, right? So a single blind method would cover placebo condition, but in order to cover both placebo and experimenter effects, we will design a randomized controlled trial with double-blind method. So neither the person who is getting the treatment nor the researcher knows who got which treatment. I don't know who got the sugar pill. I don't know who's getting the correct pill, right? And because of that, that eliminates the most bias that we possibly can from these types of experiments. Correlational design. So this again is another repeat. I will actually put up a video that helps that explains this very well too, but I'll briefly go over it with you right now. This involves tests of relationships and tests of relationships between variables that researchers cannot experimentally manipulate. So you might have heard of this correlational design between smoking cigarettes and getting lung cancer, right? There's a high correlation. However, there was never a there was never an actual experiment done to see this because one, it would be very costly. Two, no one would pay for it. Three, it is unethical and inhumane in order to actually do a true experimental design that would cover smoking cigarettes and cancer. So what we do is we gather a lot of other studies based off of data that correlates with smoking cigarettes and lung cancer. And because there are tens of thousands of studies, correlational studies that are like that have very strong correlation, we're actually able to say, okay, this tends to be very true, and we could say smoking cigarettes is highly, highly correlated with getting lung cancer. However, you'll still see that it's something that we can cigarettes are something that is we can still sell, and on the bottom it doesn't say smoking causes cancer, but it says Surgeon General warning, right? So that's something to consider as well. Positive correlations. This is where you're seeing a very high relationship rate of one thing going up and the other thing going up, hence more cigarette smoking and more lung cancer, right? Negative correlations are the opposite direction, right? So something goes up, the other thing goes down. Typically, the example I like to use that is easiest to conceptualize for most people are exercise and weight, right? Typically, unless you're trying to make gains, and I know some of you are, but if you're looking at a relationship between how much exercise somebody's doing, the more exercise typically leads to um, the relationship of weight loss, which goes in the opposite direction. So that is a negative correlation. This is something that is better described with a video. That is why I'm going to put up a video, and be sure to ask questions. Be sure to utilize the discussion board for course-related questions, and hopefully this is something that did make sense to you. If not, make sure you watch the video on correlation that I'm going to put up. Lastly, this is the type of research studies that we use in abnormal psychology. So all of these should be very familiar from Psych 101, and I'm just putting this up as a reminder for you to review and just give you an idea of some of the research that we're going to be talking about and the types of methods that they used in order to come up with those research results. All right, so I hope that wasn't too terrible. I hope that it was better than actually a Zoom session, as we talked about some of the hindrances from that. And I'm here to help you out with that. Okay, bye.